The Great Lakes hold 21% of the world's surface fresh water. 40 million people drink from them. $6 trillion of business runs on them. And right now, every one of them is dropping. Lake Michigan Huron is set to sit 7 to 8 inches below its long-term average through the summer. Nearly half the Midwest was marked as drought or unusually dry this winter. The cargo ships that keep America's steel mills alive are quietly leaving cargo behind. Something has changed in the world's biggest freshwater system, and the worry around it is growing. 5 years ago, the biggest problem on the Great Lakes was too much water. In 2020, waves were crashing over Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. Beachfront homes along the Lake Michigan coast were sliding into the water. Whole sections of Michigan's M25 highway along Lake Huron were close to falling apart. Property owners in Indiana were losing 100 feet of beachfront in a single season. Emergency seawalls were going up along the Indiana dunes to hold back the surf. Today, cargo ship captains are standing on the bridge with a depth gauge and a calculator, trying to figure out how much less cargo they can carry without hitting bottom. That's how fast the system flipped. So, what is actually going on right now? As of April 2026, the weekly federal report on Great Lakes water levels reads like this. Lake Superior sits 4 inches below its April average. Lake Michigan Huron sits 6 inches below. Lake Erie sits 4 inches below. Lake Ontario is the odd one out, actually 5 inches above average, and Lake St. Clair is holding about 1 inch above. Why Ontario? Because unlike the other 4 lakes, Lake Ontario's outflow is actively controlled. A deal between the United States and Canada lets managers change how much water leaves the lake through the St. Lawrence River based on a set plan. The upper 4 lakes are basically at the mercy of rain, snow, and evaporation. Ontario gets managed. That is why it's acting differently from the rest of the system. A few inches doesn't sound like a big deal. That's the reaction when those numbers come up in casual talk. Wait for the math. Lake Michigan alone is 22,400 square miles. Every single inch of Lake Michigan stands for roughly 390 billion gallons of water. Across all 5 Great Lakes combined, 1 inch is about 1.6 trillion gallons. A single foot is nearly 20 trillion. These are not small changes. They are huge amounts hidden inside small-sounding numbers. Want a comparison that makes it real? The city of Chicago pulls water out of Lake Michigan every single day through the man-made reversal of the Chicago River. That pull moves 2.1 billion gallons per day, 365 days a year. A truly huge ongoing draw. And the measurable effect on Lake Michigan's water level from that steady drain? About 1 inch. 1 inch. The total bottled water used in the United States for a full year, which is around 13.7 billion gallons, is roughly 1/30th of what it takes to lower Lake Michigan by that same single inch. These lakes do not move easily. When they move at all, something big is happening. And here is the detail that should grab you. This is the first time every upper Great Lake has been below its long-term average at the same time in over 10 years. The last long stretch of low water ran from 1998 to 2013, and it was brutal. Beaches grew wider, docks sat on dry ground, cargo ships hit bottom in shipping lanes. That stretch ended in January 2013, when Lake Michigan Huron hit 576.02 feet, the lowest monthly reading ever recorded since they started measuring in 1918. For 13 years after that, people thought the low water stretch was behind us. Water came back, lakes climbed. By 2020, most of the Great Lakes had set all-time record highs. The problem wasn't drought anymore, it was flooding. Now things are swinging back, and they are swinging fast. Lake Michigan dropped 17 inches between January 2024 and January 2026. In 24 months, that is nearly 7 trillion gallons of fresh water, gone from one basin. Enough to supply every home in the United States for roughly 9 months. And it did not leave because somebody opened a drain. It left because of a water balance rule so simple, it's almost a joke. Rain and snow plus runoff minus evaporation. That is it. When more water comes in than leaves, the lakes rise. When more leaves than comes in, they fall. For most of the last 10 years, the math tilted heavily toward coming in. The 5-year stretch from 2015 to 2020 was the wettest the Great Lakes Basin had seen since the late 1890s. 120 years of records, and those 5 years were the wettest. Rain and snow kept pounding the basin, runoff kept climbing. Lake levels followed, all the way up to the floods of 2019 and 2020, when cities from Milwaukee to Toronto were spending hundreds of millions of dollars strengthening shorelines that had never needed it before. Then came the fall of 2023. It was dry. The fall of 2024 was drier. The fall of 2025 was worse. 3 fall seasons in a row, below average across the basin, right when the lakes are supposed to be topping off before winter locks them down. That kind of back-to-back autumn shortage hadn't happened since the early 2000s, and the last time it did, it took the lakes nearly 10 years to climb back. The pattern is clear. Dry falls mean less runoff, less refilling, and a system that's already behind heading into spring. The 2025 summer made it worse. It was hot across the Midwest. Lake surface temperatures climbed to near-record highs. That might sound like a good thing. It isn't. Evaporation is highest when cold, dry winter air blows across warm, open water. A hot summer followed by a cold winter is the worst setup for losing water to the air. On top of that, ice cover across the Great Lakes has been shrinking for decades. Seasonal ice cover has dropped by about 25% over the past 50 years. February 2024 saw basin-wide ice at around 7%. The long-term average top is closer to 70%, a tenfold gap in a single winter. Less ice means more open water. More open water means more weeks of evaporation. And from October 2025 through January 2026, evaporation ran above normal on every Great Lake except Erie. The system was losing water during months when it's supposed to be gaining it. Now here is the part that makes all of this harder to undo. A drop of water that falls into Lake Superior today takes, on average, 191 years to leave the system. 191 years. Less than 1% of all the water in the Great Lakes is replaced each year. The rest was left behind by retreating glaciers over 10,000 years ago, locked into basins carved during the last ice age. If every faucet, factory, and intake pipe shut down tomorrow and no more water was ever taken out, the lakes would still take over 100 years to refill from where they are now. The water you are seeing right now shows what has been happening for years. And what is happening right now will affect lake levels for years to come. This is the key thing that gets missed about the Great Lakes. They do not react quickly. You cannot fix them with one rainy spring. You cannot drain them in one dry summer. They move on a timeline measured in decades, not seasons, and that means every year of imbalance piles on top of the last one, which is a pretty uneasy thought if you were hoping for a rainy spring to fix this. So, who actually gets hurt by this? If you do not live on the Great Lakes, you might be wondering why any of this should matter to you. Fair enough. Let's go through it. Start with shipping. The Great Lakes support a $17 billion shipping industry. Cargo ships carry iron ore from Minnesota down to the steel mills in Gary, Indiana, where it gets turned into the beams, rebar, and sheet steel that build American roads and buildings. They haul grain out of Thunder Bay, Ontario, headed for sale overseas through the St. Lawrence Seaway. They move limestone from Michigan quarries to cement plants across the basin. They carry coal, road, salt, and oil. Over 160 million metric tons a year flow across this connected system of 2,000 miles of waterways. The whole thing runs on depth. Every inch of water level loss forces a cargo ship to lighten its load. For a typical 1,000-foot laker, that's around 270 tons per inch. One iron ore carrier that crosses Lake Superior has to drop 267 tons of cargo for every single inch of lost depth. Over 30 or more trips in a season, that adds up to millions of dollars in lost earnings on one ship alone. At the fleet level, it is about $30,000 of lost earnings per inch per trip, times that by dozens of trips per season across a fleet of over 100 ships, and the math gets ugly fast. In 2025, United States flagged Great Lakes cargo ships carried 71.3 million tons of cargo. That is an 8.9% drop from 2024. Iron ore shipments alone fell 10.8%. The outlook from inside the industry is blunt. If levels stay below average, ships will need to watch depths and loading windows more closely in several key channels just to avoid getting stuck on the bottom. Not everyone hurt is on a big cargo ship. In October of 2025, water levels on the St. Lawrence River, which is the system draining the entire Great Lakes Basin into the Atlantic, dropped nearly 2 meters below normal near Montreal. That is over 6 feet. The marinas along that river were hit hard. At Marina de la Rive Nord in Repentigny, Quebec, Boats sat stuck on cracked, open riverbed. Longtime marina owners along the river had not seen the water that low since 1989. A few kilometers upstream at another marina, a dozen boats had hit underwater rocks that are normally well below the surface. One boat owner took almost $50,000 in propeller damage from a single hit. Emergency water releases from Lake Ontario were ordered in mid-October, pushing extra water downstream into the St. Lawrence just to get enough depth for the fall haul-out. That is not supposed to be an October problem. Then there is drinking water. 40 million people across the United States and Canada get their tap water from the Great Lakes. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Toronto, Buffalo, Toledo. Every one of those cities is reaching into these basins to pull out drinking water for their people. When lake levels drop a lot, water intake pipes that serve those cities can end up pulling from shallower, warmer water closer to the surface. Warm water is bad for water quality. It grows more algae. It strains treatment plants. In 2014, a harmful algae bloom polluted Lake Erie's water supply, and nearly 500,000 people in Toledo could not drink their tap water for a week. That happened during a high water period, when extra water was on our side. Imagine the same thing during a low water period. Current guesses put the cost of keeping up and upgrading drinking water and wastewater systems across the Great Lakes region at roughly $180 billion over the next 20 years. And that number assumes the lakes keep acting roughly the way they have. They are not. Then there is electricity. Niagara Falls hosts the largest hydropower complex in North America. On the United States side alone, the Robert Moses Niagara Power Plant and the Lewiston Pump Generating Plant together produce 2,525 megawatts. That is enough to power nearly 2 million homes. It is the single biggest electricity maker in New York State. Add the Canadian Sir Adam Beck stations just across the border, and you are at roughly 4,500 megawatts of clean power, every bit of it depending on Great Lakes water flowing through the system. The numbers on what long-lasting low levels would cost just the power industry are worrying. Through 2030, somewhere around $951 million in replacement power costs. Through 2050, $2.83 billion. That is hydropower alone. The total cost across all industries is predicted to reach $18.82 billion by mid-century. And finally, there is the part almost nobody talks about: wetlands. Great Lakes coastal wetlands are where more than 70% of Great Lakes fish species spawn and grow up. Walleye, northern pike, yellow perch, smallmouth bass. The entire sport and commercial fishing industry depends on these shallow, reed-filled edges. Lake Erie has already lost 72% of its historic wetland habitat since European settlers arrived. If water levels drop far enough on Georgian Bay, 13% of its 3,700 coastal wetlands would be cut off from the lake entirely. The water would leave. The fish habitat would go with it. And then the birds. Georgian Bay alone supports over 350 species of migrating birds. No wetlands, no stopover, no migration. The shipping industry adapts. Drinking water gets more expensive. Hydropower gets replaced with natural gas. The wetlands do not come back. And while all of this is unfolding in the background, the ripple effects keep stacking up. More than 15 Michigan counties have now been labeled as natural disaster areas due to drought, with 4 more added in April 2026 alone, including Kent and Allegan. Ohio got fast-track drought labels going back to September 2025. 4 of 6 Eastern Ontario water management boards called severe low water warnings last fall, and several Quebec towns had to actually ship in water to keep up with demand. In Duluth, Minnesota, the port is shrinking. A major grain terminal closed in September 2025. A coal terminal said it will shut down by summer 2026. The Port of Duluth's business base is shrinking, not because the market went away, but because shipping numbers and water levels are both up in the air. Then, in late March 2026, roughly a dozen cargo ships got stuck in 2-foot-thick ice with 3 feet of snow on top in Lake Superior's Whitefish Bay for nearly 3 days. The Coast Guard's only heavy icebreaker, the Mackinac, had an engine failure and could not even get through the Sulaks to reach them. By that point, it had been over 2 months since any steel mill had received raw material. Not a low-water event, but a clear sign of how weak the system has become when any one piece goes sideways. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. This channel covers geography, infrastructure, and climate news weekly, and there's more on all of this coming. Now, here is where the story actually gets interesting, because everything explained so far is true, but it is not the real story. Local news coverage of the Great Lakes tends to tell this as a drought story. Dry lakes, falling water, climate change tightening the screws. A simple, straight line, easy-to-guess story. It is not that. The real story is that the Great Lakes have become wildly hard to predict, and that is what is actually worrying about the current data. Look at the timeline. January 2013. Lake Michigan Huron hits its all-time record monthly low, 576.02 feet. The lowest the lake has been since they started measuring in 1918. Full stop. Cargo ships were cutting loads by thousands of tons. Crews rushed dredging projects into emergency approvals. Marinas across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario reported boats sitting on their hulls in mud that should have been under 4 feet of water. Fast forward 6 years, January 2020. The same lake sets a record high at roughly 582 feet. That is 6 feet higher than the 2013 low. Roughly 20 trillion extra gallons of water sitting in the basin. At that point, the problem was not shallow docks anymore. It was docks that sat underwater. Cities started marking homes unsafe. Waves that had never reached that high were chewing away at the shorelines. Now skip to April 2026. Below average again. 3 extreme states in 13 years. All-time record low. All-time record high. Below average. That is not a drought pattern. That is a system swinging wildly, and no one watching these lakes has seen things swing that fast before. The new scientific view of the Great Lakes has shifted in a big way. Fast swings between extreme high and extreme low water levels are no longer seen as one-off events. They are now seen as the new baseline. The system is at the start of a time of fast change, and it is not going to settle on any particular number. Stop and think about that for a second. The people who study this system for a living have decided, in scientific papers, that it will not settle. No floor, no ceiling, no new baseline, just back and forth. So what is causing the swings? It is a tug-of-war inside the climate system with 2 forces pulling in opposite directions. On one side, rain and snow in the Great Lakes Basin are actually going up. 30 out of 33 global climate models predict rainfall will keep rising through mid-century. The 3 wettest years in the basin's recorded history, going back to 1950, are 2018, 2013, and 2016. More water coming in should mean higher lakes. And sometimes it does. On the other side, evaporation is also going up. Summer evaporation rates across the Great Lakes have more than doubled since the 1980s. Lake surface temperatures are warmer. Ice cover is thinner. Each year, the lakes spend more weeks open to the air, losing water. When rain and snow win, levels rise. 2019 and 2020. When evaporation wins, levels fall. 2013, and again in 2026. The problem is, nobody can predict which force wins in any given year. The balance shifts, and the shifts are getting sharper over time. This is where the debate starts. Older climate models, the ones from the 1990s and early 2000s, used to confidently predict steady long-term drops in the Great Lakes. Those models have mostly been thrown out. They used oversimple evaporation math that made water loss look much worse than it was. They were wrong, and the science community has openly admitted it. That matters because for 20 years, governments and engineers made public rules, emergency planning, and infrastructure spending choices based on those early guesses. Billions of dollars in shoreline defense and water supply planning rested on the idea that the Great Lakes were on a slow, steady slide toward lower levels. Then came 2019 and 2020, and every one of those guesses got buried under record highs. The newer models tell a very different story. A 2022 study built the first ever 3D regional climate model for the Great Lakes system. When the model was run forward to 2040, it predicted water levels would actually rise across the basin. Lake Superior up about 0.19 meters. Lake Michigan Huron up 0.44 meters, or roughly 17 inches. Lake Erie up 0.28 meters. Rain, snow, and runoff beat evaporation in the long run once outdated evaporation guesses are fixed. Then, 2024 research found something truly surprising. Ice cover matters less than people once thought. Wind speed, humidity, and air temperature play a bigger role in yearly evaporation than whether the lake freezes over. So even if ice coverage trends could be perfectly predicted, that still would not tell anyone what the lakes would do. What all of this research actually adds up to is one word: uncertainty. The clearest way to put it is this: toughness and flexible planning now has to think about both high and low water levels going forward. In plain language, stop planning for one direction. You cannot. You need plans for both, at the same time, in the same year, without knowing which one will hit. For the 40 million people who drink from these lakes, that means infrastructure has to bend. Intake pipes that work at low water and at high water. Shoreline protection that can handle 2013-style wide beaches and 2020-style flooding in the same 10 years. For the shipping industry, that means fleets need to be ready to run light in low years and handle extra mud and trash in high years. For hydropower, that means extra backup power sitting on standby, costing billions to build and keep up even in years when it isn't needed. For the cities built along the coastline, that means zoning, insurance, and emergency planning that assume neither extreme is the normal. And for the wetlands, it means protected areas wide enough for the plants and fish habitat to move up or down the slope as the lake breathes in and out over decades. Nobody is ready for any of that. So, is this a crisis? Strictly speaking, no. The Great Lakes still hold roughly 6 quadrillion gallons of water. 21% of the planet's surface freshwater still sits in these 5 basins. The lakes are not draining. They are not disappearing. By any fair measure, they remain one of the great natural wonders of the continent. But the story about the Great Lakes being endless and steady, the story told for generations, that version is done. The idea that a freshwater system this huge would just sit there, predictable, reliable, easy to plan around, does not hold up anymore. What replaces it is harder to sum up. The lakes are still huge. They are also, at the same time, swinging more wildly than they have in over 100 years. Both things are true at once. And nobody, not the cities, not the shipping companies, not the power companies, not the fishermen, is built for that. The real question isn't whether the Great Lakes will survive. They will. It is whether the 40 million people and the $6 trillion economy built around a steady system can adjust to a system that is not steady anymore. And whether a basin that took 10,000 years to settle into its modern shape is going to give the people living on its shores any time at all to adjust. Lake Michigan Huron has dropped 17 inches in 24 months. Next week, the numbers update again. The shipping season is weak. The drought map still shows yellow and orange across much of the Midwest. The ice is already gone for the year. And none of the models, not the old ones, not the new ones, can say what any of the 5 lakes will look like by October. If you want to see what happens when a major freshwater system actually does start to fail, the next video on screen breaks down the Colorado River and why Lake Mead is now on a path no reservoir in the developed world has ever been on before. Click it now.